Good evening. My name is Lisa Burke from the Department of Rural Health at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we come to this webinar from. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, from these many traditional lands. Myself, I'm here on beautiful Yorta Yorta country on the banks of the Goulburn River, with its beautiful waterways and natural lands that are recovering from flood and now becoming quite dry. I feel very privileged to live and work on Yorta Yorta country, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture these lands. This evening, I'd like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us. And I'd also like to acknowledge that these lands were never, sovereignty of these lands was never ceded, despite being home to the oldest living cultures on the planet. Our webinar tonight does provide an opportunity to ask some questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And after Philip's presentation, we'll attempt to get through as many of these as possible. But to begin, the University of Melbourne Department of Rural Health is excited to bring you a webinar by Dr. Philip Roberts. Dr. Philip Roberts is Associate Professor in Curriculum Inquiry and Rural Education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Canberra. Prior to moving into the university sector 14 years ago, Philip was a teacher and school executive in rural and remote schools for 12 years. Philip has held various positions on state curriculum boards, departmental boards, teacher registration boards, and in teachers' unions. Philip also teaches pre-service teachers and postgraduate classes on curriculum development, the use of data in educational decision-making, and the preparation of professionals for rural communities. In sum, Philip has spent his career advocating for and supporting initiatives aimed at enhancing equity for rural, regional, and remote communities. Philip is now research leader of the Rural Education Curricula and Communities Research Group in the Centre for Sustainable Communities at the University of Canberra. It gives me great honour to welcome Dr. Philip Roberts for our webinar this evening.
Thanks, Lisa. It's lovely to be here, and I'd like to recognise your acknowledgement of the traditional elders of the Yorta Yorta land on which I am today myself, and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, but particularly recognise the peoples from the various lands in which the work that I'll be talking about has been conducted over many years. And I think it's pertinent in this topic to recognise that we're talking here about knowledges that have been understood, discussed, passed on and shared for multiple generations, and through education that has been going on through multiple generations for time immemorial nearly in these lands. So my topic is going to be around spatial justice and rural knowledges, or about what rural knowledge is and how that can be used in schools. I'm going to introduce some research outcomes from research over the last few years that raise some questions around what happens in rural schools. I'm going to introduce some theory, some lines of thought that we might be able to think differently about these areas of work with. And we're going to be looking at some schools that are breaking the trend, shall we say. But first of all, I think it's pertinent to recognise that there has been a number of reviews in the rural, regional and remote education. And I would need to recognise that there are challenges in this space, as recognised by the Halsey Review, the recent Victorian review, the Productivity Commission report and so forth. And these relate to things like achievement levels, access to senior secondary curriculum, staffing, and a whole range of educational outcomes. So we're not going to be talking about those in detail because that's the familiar trope that we're used to, but I want to look at some questions about how we might be looking at them differently, how we might approach this as a different way of thinking, rather than reinforcing traditional stereotypes. I'll use a few diagrams in my talk, a bit like the scatter plot here on the right, and I guess for those that aren't familiar with these scatter plots, if the line is horizontal, not a lot is going on in terms of the relationship between these two events. But if the line is on a nice angle, then there's a relationship that is being observed. So first bit of research that sparked our attention, I guess, is this bit here when we were looking at NAPLAN results. And we can sort of see at a school level in year 9 that school level advantage, or ICSEA, in the Index of Community and School Educational Advantage, which is used in the My Schools website, and then the NAPLAN reading scores, that the association or the relationship between those two things is actually weaker in a number of our outer regional and inner regional schools. There's not enough remote schools there for that number to be meaningful in that purple line. But the relationship between social background and achievement is actually more in the city. Now, that raises really interesting questions. We hear a lot in the earlier reviews around levels of achievement being below the national average, which certainly is the case in most cases. But what this sort of analysis starts to question is, maybe our rural schools are actually doing more with what they've got, i.e. they're taking kids further. So that raised some really interesting questions for us to start thinking differently about our rural schools. Another thing we've been looking at is around what we call subject access or an achievement in the senior secondary level. And in this bit of work, we've been looking at mapping who studies what subjects and the use of those subjects along a line of advantage to less advantage in terms of the child's parents, using traditional measures of advantage and less advantage, and the value of the subjects they study in relation to ATAR or university matriculation. So this is drawing on work from Victoria by Richard Teeth, and we're using it in a New South Wales context. So here we're trying to get a sense of, is access to the curriculum equal in the first place? If we're going to talk about outcomes, we need to think about what it is that kids are studying. It's something that always got my attention when I was working in these schools. And what we sort of find in this research is that, you know, the line that you can see in the diagram on the right there is a nice angled line, which clearly indicates that as the level of advantage of the student, that is their family background, increases, then the subjects they're studying that have more value to their ATAR or university matriculation increases. So again, the curriculum seems to be organised in a way that reinforces advantage and bestows that advantage back on those that are studying it. The analysis also shows the typical things that we see a lot, that not subjects are not studied as much in regional areas as they are in the city. Schools, levels of advantage of schools, the relationship to subjects being offered is a big issue, the family background, and the vocationalisation of many regional community access as well. And the diagram below that is Richard Teeth's work from 2000, just to sort of show that this notion of looking at curriculum access and achievement in this way it started in Victoria, and it can be reproduced in jurisdictions over time, which really raises questions around the equity provisions here. And that's not to reinforce the academic curriculum as being the most important in any way. It's just to raise questions around who's accessing what, because if we're not accessing this powerful subjects in our regional communities, then that's having an impact on their ability to grow those communities. We thought we'd analyse that in a different way as well and control for advantage. So we've done another bit of analysis here where we've controlled for parental background of the child. So the only thing left is their rural background as a distinct feature, because we often hear that rural kids perform poorly, but it's often linked to school or community SES. So we had a look at this in terms of year 12 in New South Wales for maths and English. And what you can see is that in the dark blue lines here, that clearly the socioeconomic background of students in the cities is higher, and that declines. So we're talking about community level advantage and disadvantage here. But we can see that the marks in the lines there decline as well across those spaces. So that's just telling us what we kind of already know in some respects. So if we control for that social background, we get a result that then shows us something that really asks interesting questions about what's happening in schools. So for those that are looking at numbers and are doing that show me the numbers thing, basically here, where there's a negative number and the 3 stars that are in dark, that's indicating that that's a significant result in terms of our analysis. So we've done what's called a matched study. We've taken a number of kids, the N up the top there, so 1,095 in mathematics we could match through to 1,722 in standard English. And we could basically say that these kids as a statistical entity are identical, except for one is in major region, one is in inner regional, and one's in outer regional, remote and very remote. And when we control for that, we can see that in mathematics, advanced and standard English, that the students are still getting a grade that is lower than their peers. We didn't see that in general math. And that's out of 50 as well. So what's happening here is it's not a social background issue, it's a rurality issue. So something is happening around the way the kids are engaging with these subjects in rural context from rural backgrounds that we can't explain at the moment. Another bit that I mentioned in this section is a study around rural STEM careers. So we did some work around what do students need to prepare them to work in rural related industries, because Rural Industry Development Corporation talks about rural industries being the largest growth potential area of the Australian economy. So in this bit of work, we worked with teachers, students and parents, surveys of industries, focus groups and students from around Australia, I should say. So it wasn't just a New South Wales study in any way. And it basically, in summary, showed us that there's this gap going on. We could see that local kids that were going to university had decided that pathway. They were fine. They were off. And kids that wanted to stay local because they wanted to stay with their community and they wanted to develop the local community and they were connected to place. That was where the problem started to emerge, because they couldn't see the relevance of, say, physics, mathematics, some other sciences to working in local rural industry, which is quite interesting given that most rural industries are highly dependent on science and technology, and that is the growth in those sectors. The other interesting thing we observed was that the teachers could talk to kids about the abstract notion of the subjects as university subjects, but they couldn't talk to them about their link to rural industry. So that was a real problem that we think needs to be overcome. Another bit of work that goes on here is this bit of work around NAPLAN. So we often hear about NAPLAN. It's happening this week, and we hear the critiques around is it culturally biased towards rural kids? Well, we thought we'd test that. So with our colleagues at University of New South Wales, we did a randomised control trial, which is the sort of experiment that you do when you're testing whether a new pharmaceutical will go out onto the market. And we changed some of the language and references in the NAPLAN test in the Dubbo region in New South Wales with the support of the New South Wales Department. And we found that when we did that, basically it would have reduced by 33% the rural-urban gap for all kids, and it would have reduced by 50% the Indigenous, non-Indigenous gap. So there's something happening here around the nature of the questions and how they relate to students' experiences and the world around them that isn't being picked up in the standard measures that we're using. So that's some results, and I wanted to start there because they ask questions of the standard narrative around rural school performance, which sheds light on the knowledge question. What is it about knowledge and the way that we engage with schools and curriculum that, at least in some of the work that we've been finding, might very well be producing those disadvantages? I like the notion of geographic narcissism as a summary of where I'm going to go next, because this notion of the assumed center of the world not being the same for everybody is a nice notion, I think, to frame some of the lines of thought. And I'm going to use a few various different modes of thinking here that I hope will come together. First one is just to mention that, look, half the world's population is now urban. So the normal experience of being a human on our little spinning rock is an urban one now. And that changes the nature of what is common or the shared common experience in many circumstances. And when we think then about social justice, we have a few ways that are typically framed. The main one is distributive justice, where we distribute resources to overcome some form of inequality that might exist. Next ones are sort of these notions of recognitional, recognitive, and associational justice. So these ones are around recognizing diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, and different ways of knowing and being in the world. And they're usually around identification of difference, including different perspectives in the curriculum, and having space for people to be able to come together to make that position and that argument. Examples are obviously the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges, historically, for instance, women in STEM and changing the nature of those curriculum subjects to make them more accessible, and multicultural knowledges, etc. These have an epistemic dimension because they recognize that people know things differently through different experiences, and that epistemic is sort of common in notions around sexism and racism, so what it is to experience these things. And another notion that's used here is curricular justice. Not used a lot, but it's one school of thought around recognizing that school creates disadvantages through its assumptions. A lot of this is the early sociology of education type work that was very influential in the 70s and 80s, but sort of lost its currency, I guess, isn't really engaged with a great deal. To this, I want to bring in two notions. I want to bring in the notion of spatial justice, hence the title. And this recognizes that we experience the world spatially, and the spatial dimension is a significant part of injustice. So this draws on a work of a bloke called Edward Soja, who drew a lot on the work of Honoré Lefebvre. But in Soja's sense, it recognizes that a lot of our approaches to justice and injustice are either historic, economic, or spatial. And the argument he would make is that we deal with them traditionally more in the historic and the economic space. The economic is the distribution of resources and opportunities, and historical is the recognition of past injustices. As a quick summary, we don't really think about injustice in a spatial dimension, but when we think about the spatial dimension, and we then draw back on work like Honoré Lefebvre, it's the notion that in a rural context, for instance, it's real and imaginary. We see it in the outback noir type novels. We see it in major events when everyone dons the akuba and the politician wears the blue shirt and the akuba and whatever. There's just this national imagery that exists. Or in Lefebvre's sense, it's perceived, it's conceived, and it's lived. It exists in popular depiction, then it's understood in how it comes together when you engage with it. And then even when we do that, it's different to the experience of people who live there intergenerationally, day to day. So it's always reproduced through our understanding and through our shared experiences. And when we use social stereotypes of the rural, we're classifying these spaces. It gets beyond redistribution. Rural knowledge then is a notion that relates to that. I'm going to go down the knowledge path shortly, but it's a form of knowledge that's grounded in understanding of rural life worlds, as opposed to more metropolitan, cosmopolitan worldviews. And this is a working definition that with my colleague Natalie Downs, we started to use in 2015 around parents of children on isolated properties and how they engage in primary school education. But it's a working definition that we're developing on through our ongoing research that I'll be sharing some of the lines of thought with you now. But it's more than just using rural kids examples, recognizing that as a genuine form of knowledge. So I guess to that map of social justice, we want to add curriculum and knowledge. We want to ask questions around, well, what is the knowledge that is within the curriculum that we're talking about? And how is that produced in space and how we experience the spaces in which we live? Most rural community people will tell you that their community is different and distinct, and their way of going about in the world is different and distinct. What's interesting about our approach to education is we tend not to include the rural as a category of difference. It's somewhere that makes it harder to access services, but it's not seen as knowledge producing and knowledge sustaining, and that's what we need to overcome. We tend to see the rural kid as being an empty vessel, as the old critique goes. They're missing knowledge of somewhere else that's in the curriculum, so we'll give them more of that knowledge to make them more knowledgeable, but that doesn't quite work because it denies the knowledge they already have. So what is rural? In this slide, I've got 4 definitions of rurality that are popularly used over the last 15, 20 years. And what's common around these definitions is that they're all sort of multiple models. There's no one answer. Okay, there's geographic sense, there's representation sense, there's the way that people experience the rural, there's the forces or interactions that are taking place, there's political or social and cultural definitions of the rural, or there's sort of land use definitions of the rural. So across these various frameworks, there's no singular way of going, the rural is a distinct knowable category. It depends on what we're looking at and how we're looking at it and what we're trying to achieve through that analysis. Or to summarize those various models, I'd say the rural is typically defined in terms of demography, geography, and a cultural dimension, and it's defined there methodologically through statistics, through a locational geographic lens, not a cultural geographic lens, or it's defined culturally through people's understanding in terms of, we could talk there, literature, art, etc., which have various depictions of the rural through them. When it comes to the Australian context, and even with our ASGS or the Monash model and health and so forth, statistics dominate. Okay, population density and distance are the dominant influences upon how we understand rurality in this country, which basically means in any public policy sense, that leads to the distribution of resources, etc. The geographic in terms of how topography or climate might exist and how the production of space and is experienced is not there, and the cultural dimension is not engaged with either. The other model that I like that builds this together is the rural social space model on your right, which is used by Joanne Reid and colleagues, which tries to bring those together and say that, well, you know, the economy, the geography, and the demography are all in interaction that lead to some policy outcome. And that gets beyond, in our Australian case, for instance, the simple designation of a locality or a person as being rural because of statistical construction that we use around them. Now, this becomes really important because statistics are one thing, which are often used for governing society, but the cultural sense and the geographic as producing knowledge is where knowledge exists, right? That's where we're talking about here. So when a rural kid goes to school and doesn't see their life depicted in the school curriculum, they're not seeing statistics in the curriculum, they're seeing their experience of rurality in the curriculum. Now, we have a few issues here around how we think about knowledge then. The first one is the last couple of hundred years, the rural has been seen as part of urbanization. Okay? Rural only came to exist in some respects because of the move to the urban environment. Now we get then what's called the global metropole. These are the classic international global cities, Paris, France, New York, for instance, London. Now there's been a huge move in the last 10 years or so around what's called Southern theory or theories of the global South. Authors like D'Souza Santos, Frank Collier, Raymond Connell's work in Australia around Southern theory that have been critiquing this dominance of global metropole knowledge thinking. And a lot of our work that we'll see around indigenising the curriculum and Indigenous ways of knowing being in the Australian curriculum and in schools is being somewhat influenced by this global trend, and is another example of recognising that the knowledge from the global north, as this metropole is known, doesn't necessarily have its greatest way of enactment in the global south that we exist in. Another way of framing this is around modernity. So to be modern is to move to the city. So we often hear those tropes and stereotypes about the rural as being the bygone era or backwards, because to be modern is to be urban. Now, when all these things happen in the sociological sense, and I won't go into a sociological essay or here on Durkheim and others, but I think one of the theorists at the same time, Turney's talked about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, and was talking about there the notion of social relationships around community and communal society being more rural, which were being supplanted by associations that were more associational and contractual, which was the move to urban communities. And that changed the way that people interacted, but also changed the way that knowledge was codified and transmitted. And then go back to my earlier point about most people being modern now or being urban, how that knowledge is understood and transmitted and what's become seen as the norm has shifted over time. So I think it's really important to come back to this Turney's notion, because we see it reflected then in our knowledge typologies. Okay, now when we talk about what knowledge is good knowledge or useful knowledge, okay, these are most importantly categories created by us. They don't come from nature, but the sort of notion of this distinction between two binary groups that exist in an artificial sense that are seen as being natural because everyone can go, well, that makes sense because it has a common shared experience, have been going on for a while. We have the notions like hard and soft knowledge, pure or applied, abstract and concrete, active and reflective knowledge, academic and everyday, theoretical and practical, etc. Now, these have been going on for quite a while. They relate back, I would argue, to this way of understanding community and place. And as they go more to the abstract, applied, hard notions, or they get away from communal forms of sharing and knowledge and understanding and place-based knowledges. And they get reinforced with notions of meritocracy. So we sometimes then do ourselves a disservice in some communities when we want that because it's seen to be linked to power, but by being linked to power and opportunity, we're actually undermining the very cultural bases and the knowledges that we have in that pursuit. In education, that has been topologified by used by Michael Young in this notion of powerful knowledge and knowledge of the powerful as one example. So here, Young was trying to get away from classifying knowledge as good and bad, but was trying to say, well, some knowledge is powerful. It's knowledge that all citizens should have an entitlement to, that's required for equality and is helping young people make sense of their world. That's an evocative concept that he uses here. Knowledge of the powerful, where he was critiquing the traditional notions of sociology, or recognizing their validity in some respects around class-based knowledge, and saying that, well, who gets to define that knowledge, and how some subjects dominate the curriculum and serve by more advantaged communities. And this relates to work in Australia by Teese and others. Now, the problem that I have with this is that it's still typologified in a standard global north curriculum. Okay, here. So, for instance, Indigenous knowledges, global south knowledges don't really get a play in this sort of dichotomy that is being used. But it's really useful to think about our hierarchy that I showed earlier, because we get into this arguments around higher and lower status knowledge, recognizing these are artificial constructs, and I'm not trying to reinforce them at all. But we get the notion that, well, some subjects have a recent history, have less literacy demands, and some subjects have a long history, have greater literacy demands. We can see in our diagram, the lower status ones are on the bottom left, and the higher status ones are on the top right. So this notion of status and meritocracy has been playing through the curriculum. So when we talk about access in rural communities, they've still got to access that form of knowledge. But it wasn't always this way. In Australia, we had a long history with the Schools Commission in '87, the curriculum provision in rural schools in '96, and the Human Rights Inquiry in 2000, basically asking the question, is the curriculum that we deliver in rural schools relevant and acceptable for rural kids? And then we have Mike Corbett's famous work from Canada about learning to leave, arguing that kids have to learn to leave their community in order to succeed in education in its modern form. And obviously that has a negative consequence. And we used to have programs like the Country Areas program in Australia that would use this notion of relevance and acceptability to help kids re-articulate their rural experiences in the curriculum. We've just somehow moved away from those discussions in the last 20 years, which is problematic because in rural studies, this dichotomy and overcoming it is a major focus of work. So there's interesting work by colleagues at the University of Newcastle in the UK, where they basically talk around, well, knowledge and expertise is widely distributed in the community. And they talk about the difference between, say, vernacular expertise, okay, expertise that people have about places in which they live and work and how they function, which is place-based, okay? It also helps to nourish and grow those communities. Now, they use examples, for instance, around veterinary science, where a vet trained in science can diagnose a beast's illness in one way, for instance, but the farmer can diagnose the beast's illness in a whole other way because of their experience. And unless the two can learn to communicate and share that knowledge and experience, you're probably not going to cure what ails the beast. And obviously we see the same thing in professional practice for teachers who work in rural communities and have to make those connections. Health services, when we have to understand community dynamics to ensure we can get people into, say, dialysis. Unless we can work with the community as a whole, we're not going to be addressing those needs. So to reinforce a stereotype and the problems that come with that, I guess, but what are the characteristics of rural peoples and communities? Well, we often talk when we read in the literature about rural places, about rural communities being dominated by a sense of community, a sense of being connected, being place-based, close-knit, supportive and caring. Okay, are some of the common definitions that are used. So if I go back to those earlier hard soft definitions or the Gemein and Gesellschaft notions, these are place-based, local, associational understandings that are dominating the way we think about rural places. And when we look at recent migration patterns and we ask people why they're moving to regional places, they want to feel more connected. They want to have a sense of place and a sense of belonging. So the interesting contradictions here with what people are saying about places and then what people are seeking in terms of the architecture of education. Now, I would recognise, of course, that these are stereotypes and the contradictions of community being equally as power-based and classed. This links to the history of education as a line of thought here too, because in education in Australia started from the capital cities and went out to basically control and civilise space. And I use that deliberately because it was used to control the moving populations and bring society and governance, but it was also used as a way of taking over and colonising those lands and part of the process of dispossession of those lands from its original inhabitants. When we got to post-second 1960s and we expanded education, the only model then we had to expand it was the pre-existing academic curriculum, which up until then only existed around university entry. Only a few people went to university. But as it grew, the model that was pre-existing for that purpose was simply expanded. We haven't rethought what curriculum we need for communities and redesigned them, because European universities have a metropolitan history, as Murray Brennan has taught us, and we're integral in colonisation and justifying the scientific basis of colonisation that occurred and many of the policies in that space, which have caused tremendous harm. But equally, we see it more now with the move towards more sustainable forms of land management and environmental management of properties using traditional land management techniques as well, are coming into the fore, because we recognise that the science we brought from elsewhere doesn't work here. So what are rural knowledges? Well, not going to say what they are, but we're going to say they have characteristics. The characteristics, if I put them on a Cartesian plane here around using Cole Maitland's notion around epistemic relations, or the sort of knowledge relations and the social relations, they tend to be place-based, they tend to be experiential and practice-based, they tend to be relational. Okay, and they relate to some of the words we used earlier, which in terms of the dichotomies. They tend to be the knowledges that are linked to the characteristics of rural communities. They're about experience and understanding in place as passed on through community engagement, which then goes back to this notion mentioning of turning, the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft. So what we can do is look at the characteristics of knowledge. We can't say there is one form of knowledge, because when I go into a semi-arid region where the population is sparse, I'm going to get a different form of understanding of the environment when I'm in, say, an irrigated or a riverine type region, which is going to have a high density population and different vegetation patterns and so forth. But people are going to talk to me around their experiences of working in place and learning in place, which are going to be based on understanding the land, understanding relationships, and connecting those to the phenomena they experience. It's not your classic abstract textbook learned away from any form of physical engagement or conversation or discussion or shared knowledge construction, which is what happens in large urban schools, or what happens stereotypically, I guess, in the urban metropole knowledge environment. And look, this isn't just me going off on a pipe dream. There are well-established fields of rural literacies that have written about this stuff in terms of literacy being distinct in rural communities, even in mathematics around spatial reasoning and how people understand the manipulation of space in rural communities in terms of, you might navigate a street plane in a city, but you wayfind in the rural communities, for instance. And these are categories that are actually tested in NAPLAN again, but then not in their spatial reasoning rural sense or their rural literacy sense in NAPLAN, because of dominance of one form of discourse over another. So what can we do? Well, to move to the final bit. Schools are faced with a dilemma. They can master the knowledge of elsewhere, learning to leave notion in Corbett's sense. They can start local and then go central in terms of the curriculum and make those connections, or we can go a bit more radical. We can decentralize the curriculum and assessment, or we can totally reform the curriculum and start again. If we were to write a curriculum for today without not thinking about what we did in the past, how would we write it, and what basis would we do it from, what would we include? I think maybe path 2 and 3 are sort of the midpoint, pragmatic areas. I think path 4 provides us with a bit of a waypoint to think differently. I think we've got to stop doing part 1, because it just causes kids to disengage, because they can't see themselves in the curriculum, which is one of the basic tenets of educational psychology. We've known for hundreds of years. You've got to start a learner with where they're at and what they understand. If we don't start with where they're at, you're never going to have an in with them. It's just the fundamental basic tenet but our rural kids have a bigger task, right? We tend to go through a phase, again, referencing back to some Maitland's work in teaching, when we introduce a concept, we unpack that concept and their knowledge of it and their way of using the language goes down a little bit because they're coming to understand it. Then we repackage it in a way that is usable and transferable, and then they increase. So in a typical education sense, if the kid in the metropole comes from the same concept, they do a bit of unpacking, a bit of repackaging of that concept, and then apply it in a new question in an exam or an assignment in different ways. That's a harder task in the rural community, because the rural teacher has to basically introduce the concept, then bring in the principles of learning a new concept in that rural context, help them learn then the context that they're going to be assessed in. So if they're going to be asked, like in NAPLAN, a question from a totally different context, they need to then come to understand that, because the markers may not understand the rural place. And then they've got to reapply that concept. So it's a bigger pedagogical task that a teacher is faced with. Or an even bigger task is often that we know in many rural contexts there are a number of health issues. So the kid, we have to deal with those health issues and access to those services first before we can introduce the concept, before we can start unpacking the concept. So it gets a complex dynamic here, but it's a harder job, by no doubt. So a couple of examples just to talk about, show you some ways that this is being done. This is a Year 10 science example. This is a school where watching the class and the teacher, and they're learning about flow, current, and measuring flow. And this typically is done in the textbook and then in examination through the medium of electricity. Now, in this community, a lot of kids aren't on electricity. They're on generation and pumps, and they're pumping water from the river. So the teacher in this case was talking about the river and forces, current and flow, which equally are happening in water, especially here where there was snow melt involved. And the kids' knowledge of the river, place, changing currents, and safety was massive. So it was really fantastic that they were able to do that, and they would recontextualize that knowledge. Not only that, they could tell you where to swim, where to fish, when to fish, where it wasn't safe to go. But their knowledge of flow and current and measuring flow was huge. Now, I'd love to take some urban kids and put them in that environment and ask them to answer questions around flow and current in terms of water and rivers, and we get a very different maybe response as we would in this instance. So they used analogies of where to swim and so forth. So they had a very practical way of knowing. And these are kids that are pumping water for their homes, literally, or fighting bushfires, as the case might be. This is another school where they've done is they've taken the Year 9 and 10 science curriculum and kind of thrown it out the window, or thrown it out, and then reorganized it in new piles. And what they've done here is they've identified careers in the community. And these careers include genetics, forensics, astrophysics, because every rural region, like in the rural STEM example, has a range of trained people in a range of the professions, if that's what we're aiming for, not to say that we should be. And they've reorganized the science curriculum around that. They're teaching all the standard material and outcome, but then they're using it around local careers and local people. And that person comes in, talks to the kids, they study it, they acquire the knowledge that they need to be tested on in terms of their continuation in school, but it's around the local needs and their local understandings of those subjects and how they're used. It sounds somewhat simple, but it's an immense piece of work that the school's done, which is really, really awesome in terms of its organization and principles. This last little school I'm going to mention is a little school, 210 kilometers on tar to the nearest town, and on dirt a little bit shorter, but they've been closed for a while with the rains and floods. And they've got this amazing farm setup. I have not been to a class in the school where this is not genuinely used as part of the curriculum. It's not an add-on, it's actually an integral part and just a natural part of everything that happens in this school. Now, this is really meaningful to the kids because they're deeply involved in this environment, but most importantly, they live in a food desert. Okay, it's changed on the side of there with the rain the last couple of years. I couldn't give you a picture of it underwater because couldn't get there obviously underwater. But here's an environment where fresh produce is at a minimum. because of the cost of transport and the health implications that go with that. So suddenly now you're able to produce fresh produce. During COVID, it can be shared through the community and then equally sold to fund some of that expenditure. It's a real meaningful way to change not just the education outcomes, but the health outcomes of the kids and the community through a genuinely integrated school-based approach. And we could talk about ag tech and drones because there's a number of examples of schools using drones in science to measure cropping through GPS, looking at gas pipes in gas regions, etc. But that's a bit more of a scientific example, so I won't go into that at this point. And I should start to wrap up. So I went through a couple of those examples a bit quicker than I might have liked, so apologies. I can unpack those in the questions. I should say we're doing a talk in some more detail on some of those examples in next week with our research team. But I was hoping in this instance to introduce the problem of how we understand educational success, some lines of thinking about it differently, and just some examples that this is happening in some context. So hopefully that all works out, and there's some references which we can share should that be necessary. I will stop there and hand back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Philip. There's a lot in there for us to think about. Is there anything else you want to say on those examples before I get into some of the questions here, and others listening might want to put some more questions in the Q&A?
Look, I hope they're reasonably self-explanatory, but I think the science one, in terms of, we often talk about rural kids aspiring to university. As we know, a whole lot of attention to that as being an issue in the public sector at the moment. And you aspire to what you can see. A lot of these jobs are hidden in rural communities, astrophysics, etc. Yeah. But they're there within particular medical sciences. And to recognise in that school that, well, the kids know the members of the community. You go into the science labs and there are kids that have gone through that school in science, and then they're on the wall, their pictures, even the ones done ecology recently and done a PhD on the wall. So the kids know them, and then they go, well, this is, for instance, this is Lisa's story. And here's what Lisa did. But yeah. Lisa is a medical, a sociologist in this case, but it's like, well, what does that mean? And how does it work? And then they bring the curriculum in. It really makes that connection. And Lisa pops up throughout the unit, and then they go and visit Lisa at work. So it suddenly makes that a knowable pathway. Yeah. But there's a form of knowledge there that's not just the abstract textbook. We often hear doing a day at the beach or a train timetable activity. We get away from those things, and this is a really great example of that.
Yeah. And we often take kids out of the local community to give them further education rather than thinking about what's available here.
Yeah, which only reinforces that you've got to leave. Even when we take them off to the city for enrichment, it's like, well, okay, but are you reinforcing that there's no enrichment here? That's which is a hard thing, because we have the curriculum that's so dominated by one form of knowledge over this notion of standardization. But we can start to break that down.
Okay, so I've got a few questions here from when people registered and a few in the chat. So we might just go to this second question. You able to talk a little bit more on how systems need to change in the middle of two of your four scenarios? So
so we have this centralized tendency. We have this notion of quality that means everyone has to do the same thing, be tested on the same test. So if I think in terms of there's obviously an NAPLAN example this week, but if I think of senior secondary as the high stakes one, so the notion that everyone has to do the same assessment and that makes it fair and equitable. But does it actually make it fair and equitable when that's based around the common experience of maybe the majority of students, but definitely not all students? Okay, now this is something that was argued in the 70s and 80s in terms of women particularly, then migrant communities, and obviously Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander communities. Knowledge is its representation in their representation in the curriculum. So it doesn't have to be that way, right? We have jurisdictions in Australia that have decentralized forms of curriculum where teachers can do their assessment. They then come together and moderate that assessment and share that understanding. And then that gets put together in the whole mesh in terms of people's achievements. So the need to do the one exam is an efficient and crude means, but surely we're smarter than that now.
Yeah.
And surely we trust the professionals that are trained in this area to make those judgments around how we do that. Mm-hmm. We have, we've heard in the media discussions around, scripted lessons because it will make it easier for teachers if they just have to take the lesson and teach it. I haven't talked to a teacher that's ever thought that's a good idea, because that is the professional work of a teacher that they want to do. What they don't want to do are some of the other things that take their time that they don't see a direct relationship to student learning. Okay, so maybe if we let them do the work that they want to do, trust them professionally, and then use modes like moderation that gives us that quality assurance, and we can be more effective. High-performing countries don't do it in the way that we do it. There are multiple examples around about that. Probably said enough.
Well, does then, is the onus then on teachers to drive this change, or is that more the short term while we wait for bigger systemic change?
I think we've got to work at it in two directions. I think we need to give teachers a language that they can use to critique this. So what I've been sharing with you is it's parts from experience of my time teaching, but is mostly shared by the generous teachers that spend time and allow me in their classrooms and schools, and that are struggling for a common language to describe their experience to be able to critique back. So we're trying to fulfill that role and give back to them for their generosity, a language that maybe they can use to start critiquing. And while that's happening, we need to be doing our work as academics and researchers in providing that critique at another level, and hopefully they can come together. I think it takes the whole community to do that. And that's just not a education thing. Education can't exist without the health services, for instance. I think we probably can't deal with education of a child or a community until we get some other needs sorted first, which is a standard recognized thing. So it's a whole of the professions that are working and wrapping around these communities to support them to have their best futures.
And universities are probably a part of this. So there's a question here about how do we create university admissions processes which privilege rural knowledges, or how do we make universities acknowledge our knowledge?
Great question. I think whilst ever, and the irony is I know I use ATAR as an access on our data analysis because it exists and it's out there, but whilst ever we're reliant upon it as a standardized measure, we're going to be having a problem. So I think university admissions need to move beyond the ATAR because the ATAR itself privileges very abstract forms of knowledge that it is biased towards assuming are better forms of knowledge. They're just a better form of one type of knowledge. Now, that doesn't make you a better rural practitioner of education or health if you can't understand a community, work with people, problem solve, and bring multiple dynamics together in one time. You're not going to be an effective educator. You're not going to be an effective person in the health services. We know that through experience. So we need other forms that include that understanding, that problem solving, even a degree of interview type notion, and looking at the pathways that people have taken to get to university. Just taking a number as defining them, which itself is biased towards a form of knowledge, isn't going to do it.
Yeah. Okay. And there's a question here about connecting to local industries. Do you have any thoughts on how teachers and schools, can do this to develop industry partnerships?
Yep, absolutely. And this is really critical. So that science example I use, so that school, they've got great industry partnerships. They're built up over a long term. Teachers that have been there for a long period of time. who have built those connections and then induct the new teachers into those connections. It takes work on the behalf of the school to do that. I've worked with some schools where they've been basically literally done mappings of their communities, where they have, around staff meetings, etc., sort of sat there and gone, well, what are the industries around here? And then done similar things with the community and bring them together, because there will be blind spots that each has. The teachers have a lack of time, so we need to free up some time for them to then go out and meet those industries and spend some time with them to come to understand, they might know that there is a particular mining venture around mineral sands that we all need for our laptops that they're watching this on, for instance, but they don't actually understand it until they go and spend time there and talk to people and build that connection. So we need to facilitate that time to do that. And then we need to give them time to actually bring that into the curriculum in a meaningful way, to rewrite their programs. And we need to give them the permission to do so. As we focus on results and achievement and all the negative discourse out there around schools, we're not giving them time to do their professional work that they're trained to do. So I think in terms of connecting with industries, it needs to be, everything has a resource implication, I guess, but it takes time, it takes commitment to build those relationships. And look, I've seen it done without time and a huge amount of commitment, but it does help. You need to make those connections. One of the biggest barriers that it can then from the other side, where the biggest block that I've seen that are happening effectively, is that the industry then is committed and wants to work with the school, because they're usually really committed to their communities and want to help and have a giving back sense and obligation, but they then don't have a knowledge of some of the administrative requirements of schools. So when they might ring up, say, for instance, and say, look, we're doing testing at the sewage works. Do you want to bring the kids down to have a look at how this works in practice, because you're doing the chemicals and science? Well, small things like we need to organise transport, we need parental permission, and we need the OHS checks. We can't just take the kids out and walk down the street. So, but they're like, well, the school never comes when we ask them. It's like, there's a little bit of understanding happening both ways in some respects. So I wouldn't say that it's all on the school, to be clear. But I've seen that develop up really well and make really strong community connections.
Yeah. And I think we do that pretty well in rural communities. Those connections. Yeah.
Oh, there's some. It's a real challenge talking about this, because there are some really cool things happening out in rural communities, but sometimes you don't want to give the game away, because sometimes they're working on the edges. So it's like, no, we don't want to give too many of the things away. We don't want to get too many prying eyes, because they're working within the grey areas of policy, because they know they need to, because policy hasn't been made to work in their context. Yeah. But we need to give them permission to adapt policy, and that's the tension in terms of practice. How do we get to a point where they know that that's part of their work and feel supported to do it? And that's a bigger issue, I guess.
Well, that brings me nicely to one of the questions that was asked by somebody when registering. If you were advocating for change at either a federal or state level in terms of education policy, what would you be advocating for?
Well, I'd have the ability to sit in the big chair for the day and make a decision.
Yeah.
I think we need to get away from this centralization tendency. We need to basically move towards a decentralized model. And that decentralized model isn't a urban city split. That's too crude. But smaller groups, because, as we all know, no rural community is the same as another. And that's not to say a single school-based model either. But there are natural groupings, so we can have a form of decentralization that exists. And this allows people more freedom to design the curriculum. And we had it in South Australia. We had it in the ACT when it left New South Wales in the educational sense, and we had it in Queensland. So this is not new, right? It still exists in South Australia and to a degree in the ACT. So we can go to a more of a decentralized curriculum model. We don't have to dictate what everyone should learn and when and how they should know it. Okay, we can get away from some of the concerns around particular notions of content to get towards practices and deeper understandings that exist within within the curriculum. We want our children to be solving the problems that we don't know we have yet, and some of the ones we know we do. That's a mental disposition and a practice. It's not just being able to regurgitate some facts, right? And we need to then build or trust the profession and build that profession to do some of that assessment and moderation work to get away from the centralized models. I think the other thing we need to be really doing is putting the value of places front and center. Okay? We need to be thinking about, there's a notion in the UK called rural proofing. So it's the notion that no policy can be signed off on unless it's shown to have not to have negative effects on our rural communities. Now, will that work in Australia? Some arguments that it won't because of our diversity and size, but we're smarter than that. We can find ways around that. So how do we put a notion in place that we always think through, will this policy impact and work in the smallest rural school? If it won't, why are we doing it? Because then that's at a disadvantage. Now, that's putting a stake out there in a point, but I guess it reminds them that we always need to be thinking about, well, what is the place of this rural community? And what is the place of their formal knowledge in this policy decision, this practice decision, this school-based curriculum decision? I think we tend to take the rural for granted, and we want to sort of walk back that step a little bit. So
that's interesting.
I would be decentralizing and putting a policy frame up front. We got away from, was it in the 80s when we had that recognition of the rural provides all the minerals and services and food for the city. The city can't exist without the rural, but now we make the rural stand on its own 2 feet economically, while still taking everything it produces. So we've maybe got to rethink the way we consider our rural-urban partnership.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. The concept of rural proofing is also used in health and healthcare, models of healthcare and so forth. So yeah, a lot of synergies there. Do you have any examples of governance models that do that decentralisation and letting our local teachers do what they do best? And
well, it happens in South Australia. South Australian curriculum is a very decentralised model. So the schools have more freedom to design and structure the curriculum locally in the schools. So that's very much the case there. The ACT being a city-state is a strange example, but in the late 70s, it left New South Wales and organising structure, but you had even less organising principles, and schools could write their own curriculum. And it kind of exists with the Australian curriculum, but it's been put into state-based documents. So there are examples out there. And if you go then to Europe, I'll go to the United States rather than Europe because I can't think of a country at the moment. But school boards are smaller, so they have much less centralisation over there. Even they can have small school boards of 3 or 4 schools, which then write their own curriculum that aligns to national standards that they're then audited on. So these models exist. Finland is famous for not having a centralised system and achieving some of the world's best results for a long time.
Yeah. And just one, there's a couple of questions that we won't have time to get to, but any suggestions for teachers who are isolated and, perhaps want more support around these sort of issues, local curriculum design and those things?
Yep. Look, that's isolation is always a difficult one. And I think in those contexts, where I've seen the best results is recognising that the community is a resource and the community can be drawn on in terms of working with these concepts because they know how it works. I'll reference the work of my colleague Natalie, who I mentioned there earlier with rural knowledges, and I think that's the best example in her work when she was looking at the parents of isolated kids in early primary school who are learning to read and write. And the carer, often the mother, but being the way that has tended to work out, would get lesson plans and go, well, hang on, this makes no sense. My kid knows how to do that because they've been counting sheep for day one. But to go and count pencils or something, or it just doesn't make any sense. So there's that constant rearticulation because they've been doing it. So I think the community is a resource if you're isolated. And then there's obviously online discussion groups and online networks, which are always a secondary option. But I think if we work with, how do you do this on a day-to-day basis in your life, I suppose they tend to be around properties largely, and you'll be surprised at the examples that come out in terms of fencing and measurement and mathematics and writing and accounting and business side of things.
Yeah. All right, well, Philip, we're out of time, but thank you very much for coming to Shepparton and sharing your thoughts around rural education and sharing much of your work and scholarship in this area. I hope it's given a lot of our teachers food for thought, and for those of us working in health, I think there's a lot of synergies. So we'd really like to thank you for your time. And just a reminder to everybody, our next webinar will be May 3rd, and Dave Coghill is going to talk to us about ADHD, quite a different topic. But thank you all for coming this evening. We hope you've got something out of it, and be great to see our schools across our regions and rural areas everywhere engage in rural knowledges and localised curriculums. So thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you for having me.